Something happened inside the White House today that has not happened since this crisis began in December. For the first time since the Iran standoff started, the commander of United States Central Command, the four-star admiral who directly controls every American warship, aircraft, and ground force in the Middle East, walked into the Oval Office and briefed President Trump on his options for striking Iran. His name is Navy Admiral Brad Cooper. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, was also present. Two people familiar with the discussion confirmed the meeting to ABC News. Axios confirmed it independently, citing a U.S. official. This briefing was not a routine update. According to Axios, it was the first time Cooper had spoken directly to Trump since the crisis began. Read that again. The admiral, commanding the two carrier strike groups, the 120 fighter jets, the destroyers, the submarines, and the 35,000 to 40,000 American troops positioned around Iran, had not briefed the president personally in the 2 months this crisis has been building. Today, that changed. And it changed on the same afternoon that the third round of nuclear talks in Geneva concluded. The Wall Street Journal published what the United States actually demanded in that room, and Oman's foreign minister flew to Washington to begin a Friday morning meeting with Vice President Vance in what multiple outlets describe as a last-ditch effort to prevent war. This script will work through each of those developments in precise sourcing order, examine what the options Cooper briefed almost certainly contain based on what ABC News reported, analyze the Geneva talks outcome honestly, including what Iran rejected and what it proposed, and identify the specific signals over the next 48 hours that will indicate which direction this decision is moving. Start with Cooper's briefing and what it structurally means. According to Axios' February 23rd reporting, which provided the critical institutional context for today's events, Kane had been the only military leader briefing Trump in recent weeks on Iran. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Cooper had not been invited to the meetings Trump convened on Iran and had not spoken to the president since the crisis started in early January. That Axios report identified Cooper's predecessor, General Eric Kurilla, as having briefed both Trump and former President Biden on Iran as a matter of routine. The absence of the sitting CENTCOM commander from the president's Iran briefings in a period of active military buildup was noted by Axios as a significant anomaly. Cooper's exclusion from those meetings, during the same weeks that two carrier strike groups were being assembled under his command and F-22 fighters were being repositioned to Israel, meant the president's primary military interlocutor on Iran was Kane, the chairman, rather than the combatant commander, who would actually execute any ordered operation. Kane, Axios reported, had been more cautious in discussions around Iran than he was during the Venezuela operation, with one source describing him as a reluctant warrior on Iran. The Axios. February 23rd report added that Vice President Vance had also been raising questions about the risks and complexity of any Iran operation during internal deliberations, though a source denied he was outright opposed to striking Iran. Today's meeting changed that structure. For the first time since December, the man who would issue the execute order to ship captains, air wing commanders, and submarine skippers briefed the president directly. The content of that briefing has not been publicly disclosed. CENTCOM declined to comment. The White House did not immediately respond. But the menu of options available to Cooper to present can be reconstructed from what ABC News, CNN, and multiple other outlets have reported over the past week. ABC News reported that among Trump's options is a limited strike on ballistic missile launchers and nuclear sites as a kind of warning to force Tehran to agree to Trump's demands. Also under consideration is a major operation hitting a large number of targets over a sustained period of time. ABC also reported that an opening salvo on targets in Iran, led by Israel, would not only serve as diplomatic coercion, but could serve to cripple more of Iran's air defenses, should Trump decide to follow up with a much more sustained military campaign aimed at toppling the regime. Analysts told ABC such an operation could last for weeks and be extraordinarily risky without any guarantee that Iran would emerge with a government more favorable to U.S. interests. The three broad options that emerge from that reporting framework are a limited targeted strike intended to force negotiations, a sustained joint U.S.-Israeli campaign aimed at decisive military results, and an Israel-first sequence, where Israel strikes, Iran retaliates against American forces or interests, and the U.S. responds under defensive justification rather than as the initiating party. The political logic of the Israel-first option deserves specific analytical treatment because it has been reported simultaneously by Politico, ABC News, CNN, and multiple other outlets as an active point of deliberation at senior White House and congressional Republican levels. ABC News reported that several Republicans and some Trump officials in recent days have privately advocated for Israel to take the lead in striking Iran instead of the U.S. initiating hostilities. Politico first reported the same dynamic. The political analysis offered by ABC is specific. Trump campaigned on the promise that he would end wars, not start them. If Israel strikes and Iran retaliates, Trump can argue that U.S. intervention is consistent with decades of policy defending Israel, converting what would be an initiated war into a reactive defensive action. ABC's contributor Ramesh Ponnuru, a conservative pundit and editor of National Review, offered the counter-argument on record. The strategy could backfire if the operation is seen across the Middle East as an Israeli-backed coup. Ponnuru also stated, directly quoted by ABC News, "I think it's important for President Trump to articulate the strategy and mission in Iran. But before that, he has to have a clear strategy and mission, and I don't know that he has settled on that yet." That is a named expert speaking to a major American network, stating directly that, as of today, the president's strategy and mission have not been articulated. The White House response to that ambiguity was stated by Deputy Press Secretary Anna Kelly. The media may continue to speculate on the president's thinking all they want, but only President Trump knows what he may or may not do. Vice President Vance's public statements today add a specific dimension that has not been adequately weighted in most coverage. Vance, speaking to the Washington Post aboard Air Force Two while returning from an event in Wisconsin, said there is, in his words, no chance that the U.S. would get involved in a prolonged war in the Middle East. He said, "The idea that we're going to be in a war in the Middle East for years with no end in sight, there's no chance that's going to happen." He also said he did not know what Trump would ultimately decide, and outlined possibilities ranging from military strikes to ensure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, to a diplomatic resolution. And then he added the line that defines the conditional logic of everything that follows. "I think we all prefer the diplomatic option," Vance told the Post, "but it really depends on what the Iranians do and what they say." Vance also told reporters earlier in the week, "The principle's very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and Trump is sending those negotiators to try to address that problem. But, of course, the president has other options as well." Vance is a 41-year-old Marine veteran who served in Iraq. He has previously stated he was lied to about the rationale for U.S. involvement there and described himself as still skeptical about foreign military interventions. His public statement that there is no chance of a prolonged war represents either a sincere constraint on what the administration is willing to authorize or a public signal designed to lower the perceived threshold for a limited strike by pre-assuring domestic audiences that escalation will be bounded. Both interpretations are analytically plausible. Neither can be confirmed from the public record. Now to the Geneva talks outcome, because it is the development most directly connected to whether Cooper's briefing today produces an order or remains one more option presentation in a series. Here's what actually happened at the third round. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner represented the United States. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi represented Iran. Oman's Foreign Minister Badr Albusaidi mediated. The Wall Street Journal reported the 5 central U.S. demands presented in the room: complete dismantling of Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, the 3 nuclear sites struck in Operation Midnight Hammer; transfer of all enriched uranium not to a neutral third country as previously discussed, but directly to the United States; a complete and indefinite ban on Iranian uranium enrichment, with the only possible exception being minimal enrichment for the Tehran Medical Research Reactor; a deal structured to last forever, explicitly contrasted with the Obama-era agreement's time-limited restrictions; and minimal sanctions, relief initially, with further easing contingent on full Iranian compliance. The Ynet report added that the United States is insisting on a principle of zero uranium enrichment, while offering a compromise allowing Iran to retain its Tehran research reactor for medical purposes. Iran's response to each of those demands was reported by multiple outlets consistently. Tehran rejected the conditions and refused to transfer enriched uranium abroad. Iran opposed the cessation of enrichment, the dismantling of nuclear facilities, and any indefinite restriction framing. Iranian state media said Iran has reiterated it has no plans to build a nuclear weapon, transfer enriched stockpiles outside the country, end nuclear fuel production, or reduce uranium enrichment to zero. Ali Shamkhani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Defense Council, said midday that if the core of negotiations is Iran's non-acquisition of nuclear weapons, then an agreement is possible immediately. That framing is Iran's counterposition, willing to make a non-weaponization commitment, unwilling to make a dismantlement or enrichment cessation commitment. But here's the complication that most binary war or deal coverage is missing. The New York Times reported that Iran's updated proposal was structured specifically to allow Trump to declare victory while enabling Tehran to enrich uranium in limited quantities. According to 4 Iranian officials cited by the Times, the proposal includes suspending nuclear activity and uranium enrichment for a period of 3 to 5 years, after which Iran would be able to join a regional nuclear consortium and enrich uranium to a very low level of 1.5% for medical research. On its existing stockpile, more than 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, Iran is proposing to dilute it in stages while allowing IAEA inspectors to verify the process. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi described the outcome of Thursday's talks in these terms, on the record, to Iran's state-run press TV. "We were able to identify the main elements of a possible agreement and discuss these elements. Of course, there are still differences, but in most cases we have at least reached a general understanding of how to resolve these issues." Oman's Foreign Minister Albusaidi, the mediator, described the talks as concluding after significant progress and announced technical-level discussions at IAEA headquarters in Vienna next week. The U.S. official who spoke to Axios described the discussions as positive. Set those two descriptions against each other: the Wall Street Journal's account of Iran rejecting the dismantlement and uranium transfer demands, and Araghchi's account of a general understanding of how to resolve issues on most points. Both can be accurate simultaneously if the gap that remains is precisely the enrichment question and the uranium transfer question, while agreement exists or is approaching on non-weaponization commitments, inspection access, and sanctions phasing. The Ynet analysis added that it is unclear whether Iran can accept the U.S. demands, especially as it continues to insist on its fundamental right to maintain an independent nuclear program. That sentence identifies the structural gap. Not whether Iran wants a deal, but whether Iran can politically survive domestically accepting terms that eliminate the domestic enrichment capability that the Iranian regime has spent 40 years and enormous national resources building. The Oman Foreign Minister's Washington visit on Friday adds a specific next step signal. MS Now first reported his planned meetings with Vance and other U.S. officials. The Jerusalem Post, I-24, and multiple other outlets confirmed he would be in Washington Friday morning. His visit is described consistently as an effort to stave off war. The format of his Friday meetings, specifically whether they produce a public statement, a fifth announced negotiation date, or silence, will be the most immediate observable indicator of whether the diplomatic track is gaining or losing momentum. If Albusaidi emerges from Friday's meetings with Vance and announces a date for a fourth round of talks in Geneva with specific agenda items, the military timeline faces delay. If he emerges with vague formulations about ongoing consultations and no specific next date, the diplomatic track is narrowing. The Axios, February 23rd, reporting on the internal brain trust managing the Iran decision, adds a structural context that explains why Cooper's briefing today is particularly significant. Axios reported that, just as with the planning for the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, Trump has empowered a small brain trust to think through problems in Iran and present him with a range of options he can exercise at a time of his choosing that maximizes leverage and minimizes risk. That brain trust has been working through scenarios since December. Cooper's briefing today represents the first time the combatant commander's operational assessment was directly incorporated. The distinction between Kane's strategic-level risk assessment, which Axios described as more cautious and which multiple outlets reported as warning about munition shortfalls and the safety of American personnel, and Cooper's operational-level options presentation is significant. Kane tells Trump what the operation will cost across multiple dimensions. Cooper tells Trump what the operation would look like on the ground, in the air, and at sea. Having both in the room, simultaneously for the first time, on the same day that Geneva produced no deal and the Omani mediator immediately boarded a plane to Washington, describes a moment where the decision space is being compressed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and CIA Director John Ratcliffe briefed a small bipartisan group of top lawmakers on Tuesday, 2 days ago. Democrats emerged saying they appreciated the administration consulting Congress this time, which Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, specifically noted had not been the case ahead of previous major foreign policy actions. Warner described the moment as an extraordinary serious time and a serious moment for America. Congressional consultation before a major military action, when it occurs, typically follows a decision timeline measured in days to weeks rather than months. That pattern does not confirm an imminent decision, but it is consistent with one. Israel's assessment of the situation, reported by Ynet, adds a specific intelligence dimension. An Israeli official said Wednesday night that there's a high likelihood of a U.S. strike in the near term. Another Israeli official said, "It is hard for us to see the Americans backing down." Israeli officials have direct access to U.S. deliberations at a level that few foreign governments share, given the depth of intelligence integration between the two countries. Their assessment, that backing down is hard to imagine, is not a prediction. It is an informed reading of the internal U.S. decision environment by people with visibility into that environment. That reading is consistent with what multiple U.S. outlets have reported about Trump's growing frustration with Iran's refusal to accept his demands, specifically his insistence on halting uranium enrichment and capping the ballistic missile program. The CENTCOM Scorpion strike disclosure provides a final operational level data point that rounds out the picture. CENTCOM spokesman Captain Tim Hawkins publicly stated that the United States is ready to deploy the Scorpion Strike Task Force with Lucas kamikaze drones for strikes on Iranian territory. The public disclosure of a named strike task force with named drone systems by the CENTCOM spokesman is an unusual level of specificity for operational military planning. It could reflect deliberate signaling to Iran that the U.S. has purpose-built strike assets beyond the carrier strike groups. Or it could represent a normal capability announcement that the current crisis has given heightened salience. What it confirms is that CENTCOM has been actively developing Iran-specific strike task forces with named components that are described by official spokespeople as ready to deploy. What to watch over the next 48 hours is observable and specific. The Friday morning meeting between Oman's Albusaidi and Vice President Vance is the most immediate signal. His departing statement will indicate whether the diplomatic track produced anything actionable or exhausted its current momentum. The B-2 bomber posture at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri remains the single most operationally significant observable. B-2s deploying toward the region would indicate preparation for the deep penetration strikes against hardened underground facilities that only those aircraft can perform. The USS Gerald R. Ford's transit from the Mediterranean towards the Arabian Sea, tracked by marine traffic and confirmed by the war zone, is expected to reach operational range of Iran within days. Its arrival at the Abraham Lincoln's Position would complete the two-carrier strike group assembly that operational planners have described as optimal for a sustained campaign, and Iran's public response to the Friday Oman-Vance meeting, whether through Araghchi's formal statement, Shamkhani's communications, or Supreme Leader Khamenei's office, will indicate whether Tehran believes the diplomatic window is still open or has effectively closed. The CENTCOM commander has now briefed the president. The Omani mediator is on a plane to Washington tonight. And a decision that sources told NPR could come at a time of Trump's choosing is now in the hands of a president who, by every account from people who have sat in or been briefed on the high-level meetings, has not yet settled on what he wants to accomplish, in whose words and at what cost. The internal tension between Kane and Cooper that today's briefing brings together for the first time deserves fuller analytical treatment, because understanding the dynamic between these two men explains why this briefing is structurally different from every other military consultation Trump has had on Iran. Kane, the chairman, advises the president on strategic risk across the entire joint force. His role is to represent the interests of all military branches simultaneously and to advise on the full spectrum of consequences any decision produces. The Axios February 23rd report described Kane as more cautious on Iran than he was on Venezuela, using the phrase reluctant warrior. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and The Hill all simultaneously reported in the February 23rd period that Kane had warned in Situation Room meetings about shortfalls in critical munitions and the lack of regional ally support. Kane's risk assessment, in the language of all those reports, is a warning about the cost and sustainability of a large Iran operation, not a refusal to execute one. Cooper's role is categorically different. As CENTCOM commander, his job is not to advise on strategic risk, but to present executable operational options and to assess the resources required to execute them successfully. Where Kane tells Trump what it will cost across multiple dimensions, Cooper tells Trump what it would look like, what the sequencing would be, which targets would be struck in which order, how long each phase of the operation would take, and what the force protection requirements for American personnel in the region would be during and after execution. Having both men in the room simultaneously for the first time, on the day the Geneva talks concluded, means the president received both the strategic cost assessment and the operational execution briefing in a single session. That is the standard format for a principal-level military decision briefing. It is also the format that typically precedes an execute decision rather than a continuation of deliberation. The Axios characterization of Trump's decision-making process on Iran as parallel to the Venezuela operation provides a specific historical comparison that is instructive for assessing timing. The Venezuela operation, which resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, was characterized by Axios as a case where Trump empowered a small brain trust to think through problems and present options he can exercise at a time of his choosing that maximizes leverage and minimizes risk. Kane was described as all in on Venezuela. The Maduro operation was executed as a discrete, bounded, militarily achievable objective that produced a concrete outcome the administration could publicly declare as victory. The parallel Axios draws to Iran is instructive precisely because it reveals what Trump is looking for: a defined objective, a discrete operation, a moment of his choosing, and a maximized leverage, minimized risk framing. The Iran situation differs from Venezuela in one critical respect that has not been adequately addressed in public. There is no Iranian equivalent of Maduro's capture, no single discrete military action that produces a concrete, achievable outcome the administration can declare complete. A limited strike leaves Iran's nuclear expertise and enriched uranium stockpile intact. A regime change campaign carries the risks that Panuru and Vance have publicly flagged. The absence of a Venezuela-equivalent, discrete, achievable outcome is what Panuru's on-record statement was pointing at when he said the president has to have a clear strategy and mission, and I don't know that he has settled on that yet. The enriched uranium demand that the Wall Street Journal reported as a central U.S. position at Geneva is analytically significant beyond its face value. Demanding that Iran transfer all enriched uranium directly to the United States, rather than to a neutral third country such as Russia as previously discussed, represents a significant hardening of the U.S. position from prior rounds. In the first and second rounds, the option of a neutral third country transfer was part of the active negotiating framework. By the third round, according to the Wall Street Journal, the United States had shifted that demand to direct transfer to American control. From Iran's perspective, handing its entire enriched uranium stockpile to the country it considers its primary adversary is a categorically different political and strategic act than handing it to Russia, a country with which Iran has a functioning relationship and which Iran has calculated would not weaponize the material against it. The Iranian side has not yet formally commented on this specific demand according to the reporting. But Iranian state media's statement that Iran refuses to transfer stockpiles outside the country is a public position that predates the Geneva talks and was not modified during them. The gap between what the Wall Street Journal reported as the U.S. demand and what Iranian state media describes as Iran's position is not a negotiating gap that technical talks in Vienna can bridge. It is a fundamental sovereignty question about which country physically controls Iran's enriched uranium. No technical expert can negotiate that gap. It requires a political decision at the level of Iran's supreme leader. The Iran proposal that the New York Times reported, based on 4 Iranian officials, offers a parallel reading of the same gap from the Iranian side. Suspending enrichment for 3 to 5 years, allowing dilution of the 60% stockpile under IAEA supervision, and joining a regional consortium for future medical enrichment. At 1.5% represents an Iranian position that preserves the infrastructure, preserves the expertise, preserves the physical stockpile on Iranian soil in diluted form, and preserves the legal right to resume enrichment after a defined period. From the U.S. side, that position does not eliminate Iran's nuclear threshold capability, it defers it. From Iran's side, permanent elimination of domestic enrichment capacity is politically equivalent to surrendering the entire program and the deterrence value it provides, and is therefore not acceptable, regardless of the economic incentives offered. Ali Shamkhani's statement that an agreement is possible immediately if the core question is non-acquisition of nuclear weapons describes exactly this position in condensed form. Iran is prepared to commit to not weaponizing. It is not prepared to commit to not enriching. And the United States, per the WSJ account, is demanding zero enrichment as its baseline. That is the core gap that the 4th round of talks, the technical Vienna meeting, the Oman Foreign Minister's Washington visit, and Cooper's briefing to Trump today are all simultaneously attempting to navigate. The 35,000 to 40,000 U.S. troops stationed in the region represents the casualty risk dimension that ABC News specifically flagged as a primary concern in the military deliberations. Those troops are distributed across multiple bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Jordan, and Iraq. They are forward positioned to support operations, to provide the logistics infrastructure that sustains carrier strike group operations, and to maintain the relationships with host nation militaries that are required for regional security cooperation. They are also, in the event of an Iranian retaliatory strike, potential targets. Iran's ballistic missile inventory, which the Alma Center assessed as having returned to pre-12-day war levels, is capable of reaching every U.S. base in the region. The defensive posture required to protect those troops during and after any U.S. strike on Iran would consume the same SM-3, SM-6, and THAAD interceptors that the previous scripts in this series have documented as being in constrained supply. The casualty risk question is not speculative. The Iranian missiles that would be fired in retaliation are documented. The trajectory they would take toward U.S. troop concentrations is predictable. The intercept capacity available to defend those troops is finite and partially depleted from the 12-day war. Cooper's briefing today almost certainly included force protection assessments for those 35,000 to 40,000 personnel. That assessment, combined with Kane's strategic risk framework, gives Trump the complete picture of what a strike authorizes downstream. The United Against Nuclear Iran Advocacy Group assessment, cited by the Iran International Live blog covering the day's events, adds a dimension about Iranian decision-making architecture that contextualizes why the Geneva talks face such structural obstacles. The UANI study found that Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei's shrinking public profile does not represent weakening of his authority, but a shift to ruling from secure underground locations through his powerful and opaque office of the Supreme Leader. The study described the Beit Day robbery, Khamenei's office, as functioning as the Islamic Republic's true command center, tightly managing military, political, economic, and cultural levers, while the 86-year-old leader largely disappears from public view. The UANI assessment stated that recent elite reshuffles and rhetoric about shifts on the nuclear file have fueled misleading perceptions of declining Supreme Leader authority, while in reality the office has been tightening its iron grip on decision-making. This is analytically critical for assessing the Geneva talks, because it means the gap between Araghchi's diplomatic formulations, which describe significant progress, and Iran's actual decision-making capacity, which sits with Khamenei's office in an underground location, is real and wide. Araghchi can describe progress in what the parties understand. He cannot commit to positions that Khamenei's office has not authorized. And Khamenei's office, operating from underground secure facilities while simultaneously supervising the backfilling of nuclear tunnel entrances and the fortification of missile bases, is not sending signals that suggest it has authorized a fundamental restructuring of Iran's nuclear program. What emerges from assembling all of these threads, the Cooper-Kane briefing, the Geneva Outcome, the WSJ demand list, the Iranian counterproposal, the Vance statements, the Oman Mediator's Washington flight, the UANI-Khamenei assessment, and the 48-hour observable signals, is a decision environment where every pressure mechanism is being applied simultaneously, and the gap between what each side can accept and what the other side demands has not closed. The diplomatic track produced by its own party's descriptions, significant progress on the elements of a possible agreement, and a general understanding of how to resolve most issues. It also produced Iranian rejection of the three specific demands that the United States appears to consider non-negotiable: dismantlement, uranium transfer to U.S. control, and zero enrichment. Cooper briefed Trump on options to force a different outcome. Vance publicly committed that any military action will be bounded and will not produce a prolonged war. An Israeli official said backing down is hard to imagine. And Ramesh Ponnuru said on record that the president has not settled on a clear strategy and mission. All of those things are simultaneously true. That simultaneous truth is not confusion. It is a decision that has not yet been made by a president who, as Anna Kelly stated, is the only person who knows what he may or may not do.